My name is Jessica Pierce. I'm 35, and I never thought the worst moment of my life would happen on a quiet Sunday night inside the place where I grew up. One second we were closing the diner after a long shift, and the next, everything I thought I knew about my family snapped in half. It happened fast, loud, sharp, and impossible to forget. My father suddenly slammed his hand on the table, his face inches from mine, demanding to know whether I had taken $18,000 from the office safe. The accusation hit me so hard my whole body felt like it locked up. I didn't even understand what he was talking about at first. All I could process was the fury in his voice and how certain he sounded, as if he had been waiting days to unleash it. Before I could gather a thought, my mother cut in, insisting she had seen me near the office earlier that week. No hesitation, no doubt, just a cold certainty that twisted in my stomach like a knife. It wasn't just suspicion, they had already decided I was guilty long before I opened my mouth. I remember staring at them, trying to understand how quickly trust could flip into something so sharp it almost felt physical. My pulse was pounding, not from fear of the accusation itself, but from the way their eyes hardened the moment my name came up. I knew that once a family decides you're the problem, nothing you say will matter. So I didn't say a word. I reached into my bag, placed the security footage on the table, and watched the color drain from my brother's face. That was the moment everything truly broke. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The weeks leading up to that night had been shifting in ways I didn't immediately recognize. After losing my job at a food supply company, I packed my things into the back of my old hatchback and drove home to Columbus because I needed a place to land. I told myself it would be temporary, just long enough to steady my savings and figure out what came next. But settling into my childhood room at 35 stirred something unsettling in me. It felt like stepping into a version of myself I thought I had outgrown. My parents owned a small family diner on the east side of town, a place that had been woven into our routines for as long as I could remember. They had run it for more than 15 years, long enough for the walls to hold every argument, every milestone, every late-night cleanup. Coming back meant stepping into the noise, the rush, and the quiet exhaustion that followed closing time. I offered to help with the bookkeeping while I searched for new work. It felt like the least I could do when my return added one more adult to a house already stretched thin. Most days began before sunrise. I'd wake to the sound of pans hitting metal counters downstairs and the smell of batter warming on old griddles. Helping in the diner kept me busy enough to push aside the sting of losing the job I'd worked at for nearly a decade. Still, beneath the steady rhythm of washing mugs and balancing daily receipts, there was a dull heaviness I couldn't shake. Something in the atmosphere felt off, not dramatic enough to name, but present in the background like static. The first sign came quietly. One afternoon, while sorting through tip envelopes, I noticed a few bills missing from a stack I had counted earlier. I convinced myself I must have miscounted. Fatigue, distraction, anything other than the alternative. The diner was far from glamorous, but it was honest, built on long nights and steady hands. I didn't want to believe money could vanish under this roof. A few days later, I caught a glance exchanged across the kitchen that lingered longer than it should have. It was subtle, almost dismissive, yet sharp enough to hit me in the chest. I didn't respond to it. I didn't want to start imagining things. The diner had been through rough months before, and stress always had a way of sharpening edges between people who didn't mean to hurt each other. Working side by side with my family again showed me how much had changed since I last lived at home. I could sense the pressure they felt, the slow season, rising costs, the uncertainty of running a small business in a city that never stopped growing, but always seemed to forget the little places. Conversations were shorter, movements more rigid. My own presence added another layer to the tension, even if no one said it outright. The strangest part was how the environment shifted around my older brother, Kyle. He drifted in and out of the diner with a confidence that didn't match his circumstances. He had been trying to build a chain of small gyms for the past few years, a dream that sounded promising when he first talked about it. But the optimism faded as quickly as his business loans grew. I didn't pry, mostly because I didn't want to make him feel cornered, but it was obvious he carried worries heavier than he'd admit. Little by little, I noticed changes that didn't fully register until much later. A drawer left slightly open, a stack of receipts out of order, the hush that fell over the kitchen when certain topics came up. None of it formed a complete picture at the time. It was just enough to unsettle me, just enough to make me feel like I was standing slightly outside the frame of my own home. As the weeks passed, the missing bills became harder to dismiss. I tried to keep a calm head, reminding myself that long hours and fatigue warped perception. I told myself I needed to focus on sending out resumes, on rebuilding my routine, on anything other than the sense that something was slowly shifting beneath the surface. But the undercurrent was there, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore once it started gaining shape. A quiet shift in the diner's routine marked the beginning of what came next. My father had spent the morning studying the weekly earnings with a tension he tried to hide, though the crease between his brows said enough. When he finally decided to purchase a new safe for the office, it felt like a decision he had rehearsed long before mentioning it out loud. He said it was time to tighten procedures, that the diner had grown busier and needed more structure. But the weight behind his words told me the real reason lived beneath the surface. The safe arrived 2 days later, a heavy steel box that took 2 delivery workers to maneuver into the small office behind the kitchen. I helped clear space for it, moving old supply boxes and wiping down shelves, but I wasn't included in the conversation that mattered. When the code was set, it was shared quietly between my father, my mother, and Kyle. I stood a few feet away, waiting for my turn without saying it, until I realized there wasn't going to be one. My father's explanation was quick and dismissive. He said I didn't need it, that I wasn't responsible for deposits or cash handling. The words were simple, but they landed with a dull sting. I had been helping with the books every evening, yet somehow I was left on the outside again, and the distance between us widened in a way I couldn't ignore. The diner took on a sharper tone after that. Every step in the kitchen felt more calculated, every glance more weighted. I tried not to let it get to me, reminding myself that the diner wasn't mine to manage, but it became clear that the trust I once carried so easily was slipping out of reach. Even when I was doing nothing more than prepping utensils or wiping counters, the air felt charged, as if mistakes were being quietly tracked on a list I couldn't see. Around that time, I found myself at a cafe across town with my friend Haley. She listened while stirring cream into her coffee, choosing her words carefully as she tried to piece together what she had observed. She mentioned seeing Kyle earlier that week, paying for snacks with a handful of worn bills, the kind of crumpled cash that looked hastily gathered. It didn't mean anything definitive on its own, but hearing it added weight to the unease building inside me. After returning home that evening, small details caught my attention in ways they hadn't before. A ledger left slightly open on the counter, a deposit slip tucked beneath a tray rather than filed away. A moment where Kyle lingered in the office longer than necessary, emerging with a distant expression that settled uneasily in my mind. None of it formed a complete conclusion, but every piece shaped the sense that something wasn't aligning the way it should. The new safe became the center of the diner's late-night routine. My father would count cash after closing, sealing it away with methodical precision. My mother hovered close, offering to double-check figures or organize receipts. Kyle drifted by often, sometimes under the guise of grabbing paperwork, sometimes saying nothing at all. I noticed how comfortable he seemed around the safe, more than anyone else. He moved with the ease of someone who believed the space belonged to him. One night, while I was sweeping near the back hall, I caught sight of him walking into the office just as my father stepped out. His movements were swift and intent, like someone slipping into a room before a door could close. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I kept sweeping, listening for any subtle signs of what he was doing. When he emerged, he avoided looking at me altogether, heading straight for the front without a word. The briefness of the moment should have made it insignificant, yet it stayed with me long after the broom was put away. The change in the household mirrored the shift in the diner. Conversations grew shorter, questions lingered, and the silence between family members felt heavier. Trust, once effortless, had started to feel conditional. I tried to steady myself by focusing on job applications and side work, but the undercurrent of tension clouded everything. It became clear that something larger was unfolding, even if I couldn't name it yet. The safe was supposed to bring order, but instead, it became the quiet center of everything that would unravel. The tension settled in slowly before it finally took shape. It began with a late-night closing that should have been routine. We had wrapped up a busy weekend, counted the registers, and wiped down every surface until the diner looked reset for the morning crowd. I was sorting receipts when my father emerged from the office with a stillness that didn't match the noise of the kitchen. He held the safe's ledger in one hand, the other pressed against the frame of the door as if he needed it to stay upright. The amount missing wasn't small. It was a sum large enough to tilt the entire place off balance. The air changed the moment he walked out. My mother's expression hardened with the kind of certainty she didn't need to speak. She moved around me more carefully, as though the space I occupied demanded monitoring. I could feel the shift in her posture, the way her gaze dropped to my hands when I picked up paperwork. Nothing was said directly, yet the accusation lived in every silence that stretched between us. By the next morning, that silence had turned into distance. I noticed how quickly conversations at the counter ended when I joined them. The glances felt sharper, the movements more controlled. I tried to stay focused on job applications and temporary bookkeeping tasks, but every small interaction carried weight. When I reached for the binder of receipts, my mother stepped closer than necessary, watching as if expecting me to slip something into my pocket. The sting of it lasted long after she walked away. My father was different. He was quieter, but not in a way that softened the atmosphere. He seemed to be measuring everything: his steps, his words, the time he spent in the office. He checked and rechecked the safe, closing the door with a deliberate press each time. It was clear that he believed something was wrong, and the way he avoided meeting my eyes made the answer obvious. He didn't think the problem was outside the family. The weight of those unspoken suspicions settled heavily on me. It wasn't just the fear of being blamed, it was the realization that my position in the house had shifted again. I felt like a guest in a place where I once moved freely, where every drawer and counter had been familiar since childhood. Now, each step seemed like an intrusion. During a break that afternoon, I called Haley. Her voice carried the kind of grounded calm I needed, and she listened as I tried to put into words how suffocating the atmosphere had become. She didn't dismiss my concerns or tell me I was overthinking. She simply reminded me that situations like this rarely resolved themselves. She said that if I wanted clarity, real clarity, I needed something more concrete than instinct. Her words lingered after the call ended. I sat at the back booth of the diner, staring at the stack of daily forms, trying to understand why everything felt so fragile. The missing money was no small issue, but the suspicion directed at me turned it into something deeper, something that tested every part of my relationship with the people I had come home to support. That night, while restocking supplies in the hallway near the office, I caught a glimpse of the safe again. Its presence dominated the small room, almost daring anyone to question what had happened. The thought formed with surprising clarity. Without proof, the doubts would only grow. And if the wrong person kept being blamed, the damage would become permanent. I waited until closing to speak to my father. The diner was quiet. The last of the chairs flipped onto tables. I chose my words carefully, explaining that the constant uncertainty was tearing at the very structure of the household. I told him the safe needed oversight, real oversight, not just repeated checks. Installing a small security camera in the office, I said, would at least give us something solid to lean on. He considered it longer than I expected. His hesitation came from exhaustion, not defiance. When he agreed, it felt like a door clicking open in a dark room. His only condition was clear. No one else could know. He didn't want confrontation until there was evidence to support it. The camera went up the next morning, discreetly placed behind a stack of supply boxes. I tested it once, making sure it captured the safe and the small section of the room surrounding it. When the recording light blinked steadily, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief exactly, but the sense that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was finally within reach. The shift in the atmosphere arrived before anyone acknowledged it. A new week had barely started when my father discovered that the envelope set aside for paying 2 of our part-time servers had disappeared. It had been placed inside a labeled drawer in the office, tucked beneath a stack of timesheets I had organized the night before. When he opened the drawer that morning and found nothing but loose papers, the look on his face carved itself into the room. The mix of disbelief and exhaustion that came from running a small business too long on thin margins. Losing that envelope meant more than missing cash. It meant risking the trust of the people who kept the diner functioning. The reaction around me was immediate. My mother moved through the office with brisk, clipped motions, as though willing order back into the room by sheer force. She reorganized the ledgers, straightened receipts, and made a point of examining every surface. She didn't speak to me directly, but the tension in her jaw said enough. The way she watched me when I reached for a stack of invoices made my chest tighten with a familiar, sinking heaviness. My father remained quiet, though not out of calmness. His silence felt like a barrier, a conscious effort to keep emotions contained long enough to think clearly. He checked the safe, then checked it again, counting each stack of bills slowly. I knew he wasn't only verifying the numbers. He was reassuring himself that he still had some control over a situation that was slipping faster than he could hold it. The weight of their doubt pressed so firmly that I had to step outside to breathe. The cold air stung, grounding me just enough to keep moving. I tried to steady myself by focusing on practical tasks, drafting schedules, reviewing weekly orders, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same question. How much more would disappear before the truth finally surfaced? Later that night, once the last customer left and the chairs were flipped onto the tables, the diner settled into a quiet that made every sound sharper. The new camera installed in the office blinked steadily from its hiding place, unnoticed by anyone except me. The clip from the previous night tugged at my thoughts, urging me toward a decision I had been avoiding. I waited until the following morning, slipping into the office before the household fully woke. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the door behind me. The small camera's memory card felt unnervingly light between my fingers, almost too insignificant to hold the truth it might contain. I pushed it into the laptop and opened the first recording with a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The footage began with its usual grainy view of the office, stacks of crates in the background, the safe sitting square in the center of the frame. For the first few minutes, nothing happened except the steady hum of the building. Then, at a time close to midnight, movement entered the frame. My brother walked in with a practiced ease, glancing briefly over his shoulder before approaching the safe. Watching him enter the code felt surreal, like witnessing a version of reality I had refused to imagine. His movements were quick and unhesitating. He opened the door, reached inside, and tucked several stacks of cash into the pocket of his jacket. There was no hesitation, no pause to consider the implications. The quiet efficiency of it twisted something deep inside me. When he closed the safe and slipped out of the office, the room returned to stillness. But nothing inside me did. Seeing it laid bare, the deliberate actions, the familiarity with the process, shattered every rationalization I had built. I had suspected possibilities, but suspicion wasn't the same as truth captured in pixels and time-stamped frames. I sat there for several minutes, unable to move. The clip played again automatically, replaying his steps with mechanical indifference. I finally saved the file onto a separate drive, labeling it plainly so there would be no confusion later. The realization settled slowly. This wasn't just a mistake or moment of desperation. It was a calculated choice. When I stepped out of the office, the hallway felt colder, though the heat had already kicked on for the morning. The diner buzzed faintly in the distance as my parents prepared for another day, unaware of what I now carried. I didn't know how the confrontation would unfold, only that the moment for avoiding it had passed. The truth was no longer a question. It was evidence waiting to be revealed. The confrontation unfolded the moment we gathered around the dinner table. It was late enough that the diner lights had been dimmed, leaving only the warm glow above the booth where we ate after closing. The plates were barely set down when the pressure building in the room pressed forward all at once. My father sat across from me, his posture rigid, as if he had been rehearsing the next words since morning. When he finally spoke, the accusation came out with the weight of a verdict, not a question. He demanded to know why the safe had been short again, why money kept disappearing when only a handful of us had access to it. His voice wasn't raised yet. It carried something heavier, disappointment shaped into certainty. The line between suspicion and conclusion had disappeared entirely. I felt it before the words fully landed, a cold shift in the air that made my pulse tighten. My mother stepped in next, her tone sharp with the kind of confidence that didn't require evidence. She mentioned seeing me near the office earlier in the week, as if passing through a hallway could be twisted into motive. Her certainty wasn't rooted in observation but in belief. Belief that the simplest explanation was the one that placed blame on me. The way she looked at me made the walls feel smaller, as though I'd been shrinking in their eyes without realizing it. The accusations layered over one another until the room felt thick with assumptions. I recognized the moment when defending myself would be useless. Their minds had already formed a narrative, one that fit too neatly for them to question. Instead of responding, I reached into my bag and placed the device containing the footage onto the table. The small click it made seemed to cut through every unfinished sentence. My brother's reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. His gaze flicked to the device and away again, his posture stiffening as if bracing for impact. That single shift told me he understood exactly what I had brought to the table. My parents didn't notice it. Their focus remained locked on me, unaware of the truth sitting inches from their hands. I connected the drive to my father's laptop and opened the recording. The room fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the machine. When the footage appeared on the screen, the familiar image of the office filled the space between us. I pressed play without saying a word. There was no need for explanation. The truth didn't require embellishment. The recording showed the office door opening just before midnight. My brother stepped inside, moving with the comfort of someone who had done it before. He entered the code with practiced ease, opened the safe, and collected several stacks of cash. His movements were efficient, unhurried. When the safe closed and he walked out, the frame returned to stillness. My father's expression shifted first. Shock tightened around his features, followed by a flicker of disbelief so sharp it seemed to hollow the room. My mother stared at the screen as if the image might change if she focused hard enough. My brother remained silent, his breathing uneven, his gaze fixed on the table rather than the evidence looping in front of us. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The reaction came in waves. My mother tried to make sense of it, insisting there had to be another explanation. My father's patience fractured. The quiet restraint he had maintained all week snapped under the weight of betrayal. His words were no longer tempered. They cut through the room with a force I hadn't seen in years. The disappointment that had simmered beneath his anger finally surged forward, filling the space between father and son with something heavy and irreversible. I didn't feel vindication. What settled inside me instead was a hollow ache, the kind that came from watching truths unravel bonds built over decades. Every accusation they had thrown at me now echoed back at them, reshaping the atmosphere into something raw and charged. The argument escalated until my brother stood, tension wrapped around every movement. My father followed, refusing to let him walk away from the consequences. The confrontation stretched across the narrow space of the dining area, filled with fractured sentences and shattered trust. When the shouting stopped, the silence that followed was thick enough to smother. My brother left without looking back. The slam of the door reverberated through the diner, settling into the corners like dust. What remained was a family broken open, the truth lying exposed in the wreckage. The aftermath settled over the house with a heaviness that didn't lift for days. The morning after my brother left, I woke to a string of missed calls from my father. His voice, when I finally reached him, carried a raw edge I hadn't heard before. He told me he had checked the diner's accounts. Several linked savings folders, ones used to cover emergency repairs and supplier invoices, had been drained sometime before dawn. The realization hit him like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. I drove to the diner rather than returning home, needing space from the fractured silence that waited there. My father arrived shortly after, holding printouts from the bank that detailed every withdrawal Kyle had made. The amounts weren't random. They were calculated, pulled in intervals that avoided red flags, spread across accounts just enough to go unnoticed in the daily bustle of running a small business. Seeing the numbers on paper made the truth stark. This hadn't been a single lapse in judgment. It had been deliberate. By midday, the financial damage became clearer. A representative from the bank confirmed that several of Kyle's loans, long overdue, listed my mother as a secondary guarantor. It meant the consequences extended beyond missing cash. It threatened the diner itself, the building, the equipment, the savings my parents had spent decades trying to protect. All of it sat on unstable ground. My mother sat at a table in the empty dining room with her hands clasped tightly, staring at a stack of documents but barely seeing them. She didn't speak. The shock hollowed her expression in a way that dimmed the entire room. The truth had reached her fully now, stripping away the denial she had clung to the night before. I watched her struggle with it, not knowing what to say, not knowing if there was anything to say at all. The decision to sell the diner arrived quietly, without dramatic announcements. It was simply the only option left. In the weeks that followed, buyers toured the building, walking through hallways that held years of our family's footsteps. I kept my distance from those conversations, helping only when needed, but I felt every shift of ownership as though it were a bruise being pressed. During this time, news reached us through a mutual acquaintance that Kyle had been detained in another state. Fraud tied to his business dealings, unpaid debts, and fabricated financial records formed the core of the charges. The details came in fragments, but they were enough to make clear that his choices had spiraled far beyond the walls of our diner. I felt no sense of triumph hearing it, only a muted ache for the version of him I had once trusted. I moved out shortly after the sale was finalized. A small apartment became my refuge, a place where the noise of the past couldn't seep under the doors. My neighbor, Lily, introduced herself on the first evening I carried boxes inside. She lent me a toolkit, offered a spare set of curtains, and eased the quiet of those early days with simple conversations that didn't ask more of me than I could give. Her presence reminded me that life could shift gently, even after breaking sharply. For weeks, I kept my distance from my parents. It wasn't anger driving the space. It was exhaustion, the need to rebuild without the weight of what had happened pressing on every decision. But eventually, they came to my door. They didn't ask to come in. They stood in the hallway with the kind of remorse that didn't need words. My father apologized first, his voice unsteady. My mother followed, her expression softer than I had seen in months. I listened. I didn't interrupt. And when they finished, I told them I needed time, not out of punishment, but because trust didn't return simply because the truth had been revealed. They nodded. There was no plea for instant forgiveness, no attempt to rewrite what had unfolded. That, more than anything, told me they finally understood. As my life settled into new patterns, steady work, quiet mornings, small connections that felt genuine, I found myself thinking often about what the entire ordeal had taught me. Families aren't immune to harm just because they share blood. Love doesn't erase responsibility. And trust, once broken, rebuilds only in the presence of accountability, not excuses. What happened to us wasn't just a story about stolen money, it was a story about boundaries, about recognizing the moment when protecting yourself is no longer selfish, but necessary. If there's anything I want you to take from what I lived through, it's this. You are allowed to step away from people who hurt you, even when those people are the ones who raised you. Distance doesn't mean abandoning them. It means choosing yourself when staying would break you further. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, share your thoughts. I'd like to know what it made you think about in your own life.